if you stand on the promenade in Davos, look through both sides, you can see this year is really feels different. Davos is different. Why? It used to be so many Chinese pavilions, Chinese participants, and this year is ASEAN. It doesn't mean China is completely replaced. I'm sure China will come back in a couple of years when we have the quarantine removed, but ASEAN is definitely rising, and there are a lot of things can connect us, and the carbon exchanges or our shared pursuit of green growth opportunity is certainly one. So that's what put us together today for this discussion. Let me introduce my old friend, Andy. Andy and I used to be co-workers at the Wall Street Journal, and then he joined the Bloomberg and lead the little conference that says to overhaul the WEF. That's the Bloomberg New Economy Forum. And then now Andy leads the China hub for Brunswick. So Andy, please will lead the keynote discussion today we'll have with Martin and Michael Sheren. Please, Andy.
Great. Thank you, Li-Xin. Actually, Li-Xin and I sat next to each other at desks at the Wall Street Journal in Beijing some years ago. It's great to be here. Thanks for the invitation. Also, a huge pleasure to introduce our two speakers who are coming to us virtually. Let me start with Michael Sheren, the co-chair of the G20 Sustainable Finance Study Group. Michael is a fellow at the Cambridge Institution for Sustainable Leadership at Cambridge University and a senior advisor to United Nations Development Program Finance Hub and an emeritus governor of the London School of Economics. Ma Jun is the co-chair of the G20 Sustainable Finance Study Group, president of the Institute of Finance and Sustainability, and the chairman of Green Finance Committee of China Society for Finance and Banking, and co-chair of the IPSF Taxonomy Working Group. Maybe we could start at a high level talking about climate politics, climate policy, at a multinational level, national level, and then perhaps get later, if there's time, get into some of the specifics around carbon trading. And if there's time, it'd be great to open up the conversation to questions from the floor. Let me just start with a question that is live here in Davos. Coming out of COP26, there was an awful lot of momentum behind the global climate agenda. But unfortunately, the global climate crisis has collided with the global pandemic crisis, with a global cost of living crisis, with a food crisis, energy crisis, multiple crises, not least crisis of war in Ukraine. Where does that leave climate policy at a global level, the climate agenda? Maybe we could start with you, Michael.
Well, thank you very much, Andy. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank Bo and all the folks at the Metaverse Green Exchange, and it's a particular pleasure to be with my good friend and my former co-chair, Dr. Mo Jun. It's a bit like old times. No, Andy, I think your question is extraordinarily pertinent and certainly one that should be discussed at Davos. I mean, it really is the heart of these big discussions. I think to a certain extent you're right, but I think we're getting two types of reactions. So many of the crises you outlined are immediate and they need to be addressed, but some of them automatically speak to policy changes that Ma Jun and I worked on in the G20 and that we continue to work on around energy security that really does point clearly to green and sustainability. So I guess what I'm saying is there are some silver linings around some of these crises that will lead us towards, and it is true, you're starting to see this in several countries, including the UK, discussions around it really moving and ramping up renewable energy. And you're seeing Germany offering by 2030, 80% of their energy capacity will be renewable. So I think, throughout all of this crisis and all these things, there are some really positive effects that are coming out of this that really do lead to solving some of the crises, some of the problems around climate, and certainly some of the things that Ma Jun and I have been working on for almost a decade now.
Ma Jun, how do you see this playing out in China?
Well, thanks, Andy. I guess the short-term issue that you mentioned, for example, COVID crisis, energy, security issues and so on, they certainly distract the attention of the people who are working on climate change and also in our space, sustainable finance. Just give you an example of this sort of a COVID shock. A lot of countries are debating on, whether with the limited fiscal resources I should be spending on healthcare or spending on green energy. And now a lot of countries are debating on whether I should be boosting my sort of secured supply of fossil fuel vis-a-vis investing in renewable energy, which is unstable in the short term. So these are short-term dilemma, which a lot of countries, including China, facing. But I'm still very confident that the long-term trajectory, which is committed by many countries, including China, towards carbon neutrality, are still being followed. And a lot of discussions, healthy discussions are happening at the international and country level regarding how to improve resource allocation, which is a topic we should be focusing on, allocating the private sector resource allocation so that it will enable a medium long-term transition towards net zero.
Just picking up on that point, the long-term versus short-term, Michael, it is difficult right now to get ordinary citizens focused on a climate threat, which is, 10 years, 20 years out, when the global economy faces a real inflation crisis that is devastating the incomes of ordinary households. How is that playing out in terms of national policies?
Well, in terms of the climate crisis, it's actually playing out and it's crystallizing in economic ways, literally as we speak. 2021, there was extraordinary amounts of flooding in Germany, in China. You saw fires and actually even a miniature system collapse because of drought and fire in Canada. So I guess we do need to multitask and we do need to work on these policies simultaneously, because even though people are, as you point out, there's huge inflationary issues, but almost all of those are supply driven. It doesn't make anyone's lives easier, but with war and COVID and supply chains certainly being disrupted, that is still a transitory threats, whereas the climate ones, which are playing out simultaneously, are more existential, and in many ways they're not 20, 30 years off. As I said, we're seeing those if you speak to insurance companies and in banks and other parts of the financial systems that are actually contending with these. So I guess my answer to you is that we need to be able to multitask. And I guess the hardest part to do on this is not only contend with these, but you're right, people have every single day, they've got the things that they have to work with, the cost of filling up the tank of their car, their groceries are difficult, but also they need to be told that the positive externalities towards transitioning to a more sustainable economy around not just things like cleaner air and water, but better jobs and sustainable jobs for themselves and for their children are absolutely have to be in the forefront of the discussion, because ultimately, if you just keep piling on the things that the average person globally is contending with right now, it's incredibly difficult and stressful. So I think that one part of that focus needs to be around that this transition and the need for energy security does provide those jobs, and there are positive externalities that come out of that clean energy or those clean cars. Just one fast example is we had a little girl a few years ago who died in London because of the NOx particles that came from diesel cars. Well, both China, the UK, and a variety of other countries are transitioning very quickly to electrics. And there's still some negative externalities tied to those, but ultimately the ones that are really threatening to your lifestyle, those will go away. And I think that needs to be communicated to people.
To pick up on what you just said, the upfront cost of the energy transition is going to add to inflation, at least in the short term. Margin, what is the debate around that in China now?
Well, we feel lesser pressure from the inflation side, because China's CPI inflation is still running at 1.something%, unlike many OECD countries which are seeing 10%, and so it's a lesser problem for us. But let me come back to the issue you raised, the short-term versus long-term. There are a lot of short-term decisions we need to make today, but still there are a lot of long-term decisions we, mainly the economic agents, need to make. Just to give you an example, the short-term decision I'm making is that whether I should be, riding a bicycle, or should be hiring a taxi that burns fossil fuel. That's a short-term thing, right? Which is influenced by a lot of short-term factors. But the long-term decision in the economy include, for example, I need to build a building which will last for 70 years. And should this building be a green building or net zero building, or a building that follows the current standards? That's a long-term decision. The second example is I'm building the transport infrastructure, right? It could be a road, or it could be a railway, or it could be something else. And carbon incentives could be very different by different design. So what I'm saying that in our space, the green sustainable finance, we need to make sure that most of the long-term decisions involving a lot of money from private sector versus public sector still should be gearing towards green and carbon neutrality, despite the fact that in very short term, we're facing all these difficult choices.
Michael, are we seeing long-term investment still going into that sector, or are we seeing a retreat?
I don't know if we're seeing a retreat, but as Mahjong pointed out, we need to make really smart long-term decisions now. A simple example is policy around how you build new build houses. I mean, they need to be energy efficient. The amount of additional or marginal increase in the cost of building a house that's better insulated and has heat pumps versus waiting 10 years now, and so many countries have already pledged net zero carbon. So some of these long-term decisions you make today actually aren't that much more expensive, but they play into it. And you've heard our friend Mark Carney talk about the tragedy of the horizons, but this is also a tragedy of the commons as well. So making good, smart, short-term decisions that play out in the long term are much cheaper and less inflationary now than waiting later and having to retrofit.
I guess if you were looking for good news, you'd be looking at Australia right now, which has just voted back in a Labor government, partly, propelled by voters who are demanding greater action on climate. Is Australia a bellwether or an exception?
I'd like to think that it's a bellwether. Certainly, that their new leader has come out saying that they want to be a renewable powerhouse. And ultimately, being with having so much sun and wind and land, it's an obvious play for Australia. But ultimately, putting that long-term investment in now around batteries, around storage, it just makes sense for both energy security as well as ultimately the economic benefits. Once these are up and running, the cost of maintaining them, whether it's a wind turbine or whether it's an electric vehicle, are much lower. So you're investing in a less inflationary and a better cost basis type of economy. So I hope they're both bellwether. It was very uplifting to see the results of that election.
Majin, how do you read public opinion in China on the climate issue now?
Well, public opinion is very much shaped by opinion leaders. Of course, initially, I guess nearly 2 years ago, it started on carbon neutrality with the government pledge. President pledged this 2060 carbon neutrality. Then I think a lot of opinion leaders, including us in the academic space, financial space, we need to educate the participants of the market so that they can fully understand the logic of that goal. For example, we, namely the China Green Finance Committee, which I chair, we published many reports, including one that's more than 100 pages, saying the following. Number one, this carbon neutrality is going to create huge opportunity for the financial sector. Opportunity would involve 470-something trillion RMB worth of green investment in the coming 30 years. So if you missed the boat, you missed most of the growth, right, as a financial firm. And we tell them what are the opportunities in terms of investing in renewable, investing low cost, low carbon transportation, in green building, industrial decarbonization, and so on. Opportunities are being identified for banks and pension funds, insurance companies, investment firms, and so on. And also we tell them that if you don't do that, you're going to end up with a lot of stranded assets. And for example, those carbon intensive assets, without transitioning towards net zero in a limited period of time, will end up with NPL ratio of maybe 20-something% in 10 years. So these are the type of analysis interpretation that's shaping a lot of market players' behavior, opinion. And I think partly as a result, I can tell you last year, our green lending went up 33%. And we now is the largest green lending market. And our green bond issuance went up 170% last year, being the second largest green bond market.
And yet at the same time, China is investing even more in coal. Coal production is hitting records. At what point do you think that these investment decisions, investments that are going in now, actually threaten China's long-term ability to meet its climate targets?
As I said, there are a lot of short-term issues, including last year we had a big power shortage. And with the shortage, we ended up with the closure of a lot of factories, and even traffic lights had to stop. And now we're facing another round of energy crisis. So it's a reaction, not just in China, but many other countries, and beginning to boost fossil fuel related activities. And once again, I would say this is a short-term reaction of certain parts of the sort of decision-making process, which I'm confident that it's going to go away when all these short-term shocks are disappearing from the, what we are sort of seeing.
What I'm reading from the official Chinese press appears to be now less of an emphasis on the climate transition and more emphasis on economic stability. Is that am I misreading that or what?
You cannot blame any, economic policy maker focusing on employment, right? This is certainly something, they believe as a major job of being a politician. But the question, for us in the climate space is to help them to balance the short-term and long-term goals without generating so much of a social stress in the immediate future, but at the same time steering the direction towards net zero.
Michael, in the West, the debate is playing out in a slightly different way, but in a highly polarizing way, where you have the political right accusing climate activists of destabilizing the economy, depressing investment in fossil fuels, in industry, leading to supply shortages and adding to inflation. And then on the other hand, people saying actually the economic insecurity arises from our dependence on people like Vladimir Putin exporting their oil and gas, and the answer to that is a greater investment in renewables. How do you see this debate developing over the coming years?
You're absolutely right. There does seem to be some split, and a good example, I guess, was last year in Texas, when their grid withstood, or didn't withstand actually terribly well, a large ice storm. And again, actually, it turned out it was their wind and their renewables that helped them. And it turned out again this year during severe heat. So I guess part of the discussion, and as we've talked about this several times, and this is a global issue around energy security, really the investment will ultimately provide security in getting those people who are either for ideological purposes or just simply political purposes that are on the other side of that. Just talk what it really comes down to, which is jobs. You can see in the US the amount of jobs in coal versus those in green and sustainable industries. The green and sustainable ones are increasing literally by a multiple, where those in coal continue to go down. And I guess if I can unpack a little bit more of what Majun was saying, I mean, if you think about every industry, it's going to have to either retrofit itself or it's going to have to substitute. And so involved in that is a huge amounts of opportunity for basically funding or financing that CapEx and that R&D that provides that retrofit or that substitution. And that means jobs. And I think that's really what the discussion needs to be. And that's what should cut through. And look, I wish we could say that the energy transition will be without bumps, but I think it's just almost trying to take an entire global system of energy and do it without a few hiccups in some countries is just simply probably not possible. But as long as people understand that they're getting energy security, that the path of travel is the right one, that the jobs are there and the funding, the financing is there. I mean, you obviously heard at COP27, the amount of money that was pledged towards these green investments. But that money right now is parked. It's parked in bonds and securities all over the world. And it's not moving from its current parking spot spot until you get that CapEx and that R&D. I think it was the fourth quarter of last year, Ford Motor Company put $11 billion into retrofitting their factories to make electric vehicles. That's real money from the financial system going into real jobs to grow. And I think that's got to be the message that brings the different sides together, because ultimately it's about jobs, economic growth, and energy security. And there's only one path that will lead you there, and that's around a sustainable transition in the energy field.
It seems to me that the Democrats are losing that argument that, you know, if you read the mainstream media, Biden's climate agenda is more or less dead, ripped apart by certain members of his own party.
What I do find it extraordinary is certainly not just the Democrats, and I agree that some of it has certainly been lost. I think just generally, the discussion we're having here right now, I would argue that all of these different Davos discussions should be streamed live to everyone so they can hear about it. Because if you have a good, non-patronizing discussion with your population, i.e. policymakers and politicians, about the jobs, about the energy security, about basically the free riding positive externalities, because all you're getting from the economic energy system right now, most of it are negative externalities, ultimately. And so I think one of the greatest failures, and this is not just the United States and not just the Democrats, but I think globally for policymakers, we're all talking to each other, leaders here in Davos, and we certainly talk at the G20, and we do talk in Whitehall and in Washington, but I think having good discussions and debates so people understand where the facts are and where their jobs are and where their kids' jobs are really important. And I think globally, policymakers really haven't done as good a job on this as they should have or could have.
Margin, question for you. And while I pose this question, perhaps the audience can think of some questions if there's time for one or two from the floor. One of the topics at our lunch here, the Caixin lunch today, was around whether or not the United States and China could rise above their differences over trade, over investment, over ideology, over security, and collaborate on big global issues. They obviously haven't got together and overcome deep differences when it comes to the pandemic. Do you think that these two countries, the world's two largest economies, will find common ground eventually on the fight against climate change?
That's a great question. In fact, I think one of the very few areas that China and the US are still collaborating is climate change. The other ones may be healthcare and so on, but climate change is clearly where actions are being taken. For example, my good friend Sheren, who is the chief negotiator on behalf of China climate change, is talking to John Kerry in the past few years. And I saw a picture of him talking to John yesterday in Davos. And myself, representing China, now co-chairing the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group. I'm working with US Treasury counterpart. So it's a US-China co-chairing this working group now, which used to be co-chaired by myself and Michael Sheren back a couple of years ago. But I think the China-US collaboration on this particular initiative has been quite successful. Last year, the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group produced a roadmap which guides international work on sustainable finance in a few directions. One is the need is recognized to increase the comparability, interoperability, and eventually consistency of global sustainable finance standards. What do we mean by that? Let me give you an example of taxonomy. Michael, you remember back 7 years ago, we talked about lack of taxonomy, lack of definition of what is green. And now we have too many taxonomy, 200 taxonomies in the world. You know, everybody defines what is green in its own way, a lot of inconsistency, and it's hard for green money to move across border. Because what's green in one country may not be considered green in another country. That's one area G20 is pushing for consistency. And secondly, it's a G20 endorsement of ISSB, namely the International Sustainability Standard Board, which was launched recently. And that's going to create a set of internationally consistent reporting standards for sustainability, including carbon-related information, environmental biodiversity, and so on. And the third example is a G20 decision to create a framework on transition finance so that we can more effectively mobilize financing to support carbon-intensive companies to move towards net zero.
Yeah, a question for both of you. What should global leaders gathered here in Davos be focused on this week in discussion on the climate crisis?
No, I wouldn't speak too much on the overall climate agenda that a lot of other senior politicians are talking about. But let me focus on the financing side. I think we need to, number one, mobilize a much greater amount of private sector money for sustainable investments globally. And secondly, the OECD countries should honor its commitment to make available $100 billion per year to developing countries' climate action. And thirdly, technologies, especially green and low carbon technologies, need to be made available for emerging markets to enable them to embark on decarbonization at a lower cost.
If I can jump in, I think Majun's spot on, especially when it comes to the emerging markets. And I think both being able to transfer both financing techniques, but more importantly, innovative breakthroughs. Standard Chartered did a report, I think about a month ago, and they talked about for emerging markets to get to net zero by 2060, it was going to take 100 trillion, and most of that money was going to have to come from transfer payments. And so if it takes 100, and by the way, just to give you an idea, the G20 countries are roughly 80-ish% of carbon emissions. And so if you take a look at the emerging markets, roughly say they're 20, they're probably a little bit more because I believe they include India and a few others into there. The amount of money that needs to go into that is going to be huge. So I think what people should be talking about at Davos is not just getting commitments on that money, but how to mobilize it. And it's certainly, it does require some catalysts, and certainly the IMF, the OECD, and even the G20 ministers last June came out around, should there be a carbon tax, something that mobilizes the real economy, which then would give what Majun and I are experts in, and that's the financing side, because once you have to actually start decreasing or changing your business model, if your real economy business model changes, as I pointed out before, that takes CapEx and R&D, and ultimately CapEx and R&D gets financed. And so a catalyzing, some type of catalyzing event that gets that real economy movement that allows all of us who have been thinking about how to finance it an opportunity to actually start financing it as the real economy starts moving in a sustainable direction at a far greater and a lot faster pace. So I think that's a discussion.
To that point, Michael, what is the most positive factor you can point to?
I guess my point would be the positive point is the solutions are there. The solutions that we need for a new sustainable economy are there. Basically, things like if you think about giving the sea a break, there's great substitutions for seafood, whether it be plant-based or lab-based, electric vehicles, you're seeing mobility, basically sustainable buildings. So all of the changes, all the technology for a new sustainable economy are there. Basically, we just need for that impetus, for that drive to take place to get them on. But ultimately, that, if I were to say what would be the one positive thing, and I think the Metaverse Green Exchange is a great example of that technology, being able to provide the solutions around carbon credits, because net zero carbon means net, and you can only net off against one thing, and that's a carbon credit. And so using the technology, whether it's in food, in agriculture, mobility, housing, or energy, I think is the positive thing that will take us there. And as Majun and I have been working on for over a decade now, we think we've got a lot of the tools for financing that ready to go. Majun, I'll hand over to you for final comments.
I do agree with Michael that a lot of the ingredients are ready. For example, money, technology, talents, and so on, they're just not in the right place. And they're not convened in an effective way to deliver the climate results in many countries. And that's why I think the market should be playing a much bigger role, and including exchange like the ones that we are discussing.
Majun, Michael, Sheren, thank you for a fascinating conversation, and thank you to the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andy, for the wonderful moderation of this, and thank you, Marjorie, and thank you, Michael Sheren, for joining us remotely. We hope to welcome you back to Davos in January. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Andy. And I remember Erik usually. You remember often meeting him after he does cross-country skiing, and that's a very good thing to start a Davos trip. Yeah, that's true. But we'll switch to hiking. Erik is the currently the first chief economist of Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, and they do lead many of the green projects, not just in China, but in Asia in general. We'll hear that shortly. And Lauren Sorkin is executive director of Resilient City Networks. So speaking of the alliance and collaboration among the developing world, I think Lauren knows a lot about how to put different stakeholders in the same room and convince them this is the way going forward. So Erik, could you, can we start with you and sharing with us what is the ESG or the green related efforts from AIIB, and how do you see the carbon markets, since we're going to talk about carbon markets in the emerging countries, how do you see that evolving?
Well, thank you, and thank you for inviting me to this session. And I had expected a slightly different conversation, but I think we will probably get there at some point to talking about how to connect different carbon exchanges, and which I think is extremely important and something that if we can be part of that, that would be great. So yeah, very briefly on AIIB, it's a 6-year-old institution now. It has 109 members. India is our largest single client. We are very much in the climate space. Our objective is to be 50% climate by more than 50% climate by 2025. And so a lot of what we are doing so far has been focused on individual investments, so working with individual clients in the climate space. I think increasingly, and of course that's also, I hope it's going to be my role to be part of developing also the sort of policy side and making sure that these go hand in hand. And of course, as we become more important as an investor, we hopefully we will also be able to be more impactful in the policy space. And I think it's so critical in this when you talk about these issues that they have to work together. And of course, if you're setting up a metaverse green exchange, of course, that you have to be recognized by the authorities, and you have to, it is a very important exchange to be had. So I said a few things about the ESG in Asia in the previous session here, but I think so Asia is, and I would say probably the emerging world in general is a little bit behind. We had some conversations in the intermission here about that. I think it's on the one hand, it's very understandable. Most of these countries have nothing to do with the problem that has emerged, and they felt that their growth being constrained for something that they were not part of is clearly unfair, and we shouldn't forget that. But I think they're increasingly recognizing that this is something that cannot be stopped, and they don't want to be part of slowing down, because they're seeing the impact that climate is having. Certainly in China, certainly in India, but all over, climate is already upsetting the lives of many people and the individual economies. So what I think has been happening in this discussion from the sort of emerging economy perspective is that, and we are, by the way, I think we are the only sort of global institution where emerging countries have a majority of the votes, and that's, so we see particular role in trying to engage with the emerging world and be a sort of voice for the emerging world. So when you see what has happened, and if you look at what happened in Glasgow, there's a shift away from this saying, we want to develop first and then we can start dealing with our sustainability issues. It's much more about, you need to help us get the resources that are needed and the technologies that are needed to be part of this journey. And if I say one thing that I want to be part of at AIIB is to try to, in a small way, contribute to making sure that no countries are left behind in this climate effort. So I could speak a long time about it. Since I spoke about ESG in the previous session, there was one thing that I didn't bring up that I should have brought up, which I think is very important. When you look at how these ESG measures are applied now, I would argue that they're very discriminatory against emerging and developing economies, and we need to get away from that. We need to think about the way that is more inclusive and does recognize the differences in economic structures and so on. And it's not only that they are discriminatory. A lot of major institutional investors do not include emerging economies explicitly, and that is, I think, also something that we have to fight. And there's huge opportunities for emerging economies to contribute. And the first report that I was part of producing at AIB was on the global value chains. And of course, it was triggered by what we've seen in the global value chains in the pandemic. But really what when we started realizing or looking closely at these global value chains, what's really going to be completely transformational for them is the decarbonization and the pressures to, at each step of the value chain, look for opportunities to decarbonize. And the pressures are enormous from the financial sector, from civil society, from also, I think a lot of people don't want to work in organizations that don't respect, the sustainability issues. So those, looking at these global value chains and looking at the increasing role that emerging and developing countries are playing in these global value chains, I think there we have a fantastic opportunity, because what really the basis of this global value chains is the ability of individual firms, the lead firms in these value chains, to enforce standards along the value chains. And maybe today it hasn't been all about decarbonization, but they have the potential. That's what the basis of their competitiveness and why they have been so successful is the ability to enforce standards. If we can work with lead firms to do this, it's going to be, I would argue, the most powerful mechanism we have for enforcing decarbonization across countries. With these, we have a lot of peer pressure and those things, but this is, as we see, it's not powerful enough. We need something, that need to be real implementation. And here I would argue that the global value chains are very much part of that. I had an opportunity to talk about this report to all the finance ministers of the Arab world, and of course the Arab world has been, very difficult for them to come into these global value chains. But when I spoke about the opportunities now, because of, if you can offer decarbonization opportunities, that is a huge possibility to attract global value chain investment. And as you know, many of these countries have made massive investments in solar, in wind. And so look at what Egypt has done, look at across all North Africa, for example, massive investments. This could be part of the beginning of building something new in these countries. So I think the climate is not just a burden, it's also a lot of opportunities. And that's what I want to emphasize. Thank you.
Thank you, Erik. And we'll come back to a lot of the points you pointed out, but let me turn to Lauren first. And Lauren, introduce to us what Resilient City Networks does and how you see the change of awareness or capacity, or how they would be likely to reacting to the problems Erik just pointed out.
Hopefully you can hear me well. I have a loud voice. So I'm really glad to be here. Thank you for having me. And I guess I just want to acknowledge that there's a lot of familiar face in the audience, Karina Ten from Temasek and other friends. It's great to be here and to be speaking about this issue, and specifically to speak about ASEAN and the opportunity that's there. And I don't want to walk away from that, but also to acknowledge the two of us are obviously not native to ASEAN. And I hope that in the future, one of the members of my team from Indonesia or India will be sitting here in my place. But I do want to talk about really this moment, right, that we're having right now, because we've come out of COVID, we are recognizing the climate crisis, and that's really emphasized that we have to build resilience to different kinds of shocks and stresses. And that kind of capacity has to be built over time, and it has to be built with incredible attention to equity. And I think that those are a lot of the points that Erik was making. He was specifically talking about kind of climate equity and climate justice, but it is quite a bit broader than that. I mean, if you look at this rarefied space that all of us have the privilege to be in, and you think about what's happened over the past 2 years, you know, the richest 10 people in the world doubled their fortunes while 99% of humanity's incomes were reduced, right? And you have, you know, 1% of the global population, we all know these statistics, who control 35% of private wealth. That's part of why we're here, is because we want to tap that and we want to channel it for good, right? But at the end of the day, there is a basic set of principles that we have to work towards, and to democratize the access to solutions, right? And technologies is a really big part of what we have to do. So just to put a finer point, I guess, on resilience and why we have to build this kind of integrated capacity, when we look at Asia and the Pacific, 98 of the 100 most vulnerable cities to climate and geophysical impacts are in Asia and the Pacific, and they're mostly coastal cities, right? And we have over 55% of the population in Asia Pacific living in those spaces, more than 2.3 billion people, right? And those are people who need to be protected adequately. So we need to work on working towards net zero, but also working towards safe and equitable outcomes. So what Resilient Cities Network does is we work with our city members. We have over 97 of them around the world in 5 regions, including 21 in Asia and the Pacific. We build their capacity through tools and training and putting an officer in government who then looks at that long-term planning and helps to prioritize that. I have the privilege of being the executive director of the network, and we actually moved that network, and Karina knows the story very well, from New York, where it was founded almost 10 years ago, to Singapore. And the reason that we did that is because there is no other global network of cities that is based in Southeast Asia, despite the fact that it is the fastest urbanizing region in the world. So you combine that high vulnerability with the fact that about 50% of the infrastructure that we need in urban areas in Asia and the Pacific hasn't been built yet, right? It's why we need institutions like the AIIB to keep growing so quickly and working with the private sector, because we actually have a once in a lifetime opportunity to build better. And people keep talking about build back better. I'm like, no, 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 no. Let countries who are building back build back better. That's their responsibility, and they're putting in policies for net zero. Countries that are building for the first time, right, and upgrading from slum areas to sanitation, piped water, affordable housing, right? This is our opportunity to do something very meaningful that is both low carbon and safe. And in order to do that, we have to share knowledge. I think I agree very much with the speakers before, Michael and with Majun, that the solutions are there, but we have to very rapidly accelerate the investment in those solutions. And we have to actually change the expectations we have about how much profit we're going to make about those solutions. People don't like to talk about that. They want to all talk about impact investment and making 8% on all of your new returns because everyone wants to find the new climate unicorn. Awesome. There are definitely some of those out there, but there's a lot of hard work that needs to be done on public infrastructure. So we prioritize working with cities, providing that kind of capacity in the cities so that when amazing investors and solutions and technologies go out, they have a sparring partner in the cities. So I hope I can leave it there to start and we can go deeper.
Lovely, thanks. That's very fascinating. And I see people nodding and thinking, and we try to make this as interactive as possible. So whenever you want to stop by, make a comment, make a question, raise your hand, jump in. We'll have a phone, have a microphone, or you can just speak loud. You know, we can hear that as well. So everyone talks about, I think the previous panel, they talk about what the global leaders can do. And just now, Erik and Lauren shared with us, the practitioners can do and provide the solutions on the ground. And Erik said talk about the discriminatory system against developing countries, and Laura talked about that too. But where's the starting point? I mean, we need knowledge, we know we need financing. Which are the early, maybe there are low-hanging fruits we can start immediately?
No, I think the thing that people are extremely aware of, and particularly in these vulnerable cities, is I think they are becoming aware of their vulnerability. But the first thing they see, in most cases, is the pollution. And certainly, when we talked a bit about this in the previous session, if I look at the change in mindset in people in Asia, and that goes for, I think, ASEAN as well. It's really if you think about Indonesia, which you think about certainly what's happened in India, what happened in China, the environment was the kind of wake up call, and we should build on that because it is extremely closely related. By the way, it's not only in the emerging world. I mean, I can tell you, I used to live in London, and the London, it's not polluted in the same way as India and as Delhi or Beijing, but it is it was a wake up call for many people when we realized that there were 20,000 excess deaths because of the pollution in London. So these are things that that's I think where we should start. I mean, and of course, as you said, what is particularly difficult to get going is the adaptation. All these investments that are needed to protect individuals, because they are not global public goods typically. Sometimes they could be regional public goods possibly, but a lot of this is about private goods. It's about what I do as an individual, or what a company does, or maybe sometimes what a city does to protect itself. But how do we get those going? And it's very difficult speaking as a sort of development banker, when there are no revenue streams often with these investments. So how do we build them? And it goes for a lot of other things in the climate-based and nature-based solutions. How do we get revenues that we can use to structure financing? That's a very real challenge.
I want to pick up on a couple of points that Erik made. I think in terms of where we start, I think we need to use a much more common set of principles for deciding where we're working. And a lot of that data is readily available. I remember when I started working at the Asian Development Bank in 2008, we used to have to go and ask the Australian colleagues at CSIRO for downscaled climate modeling to get the best models for working in some of our projects. And now a lot of that data is available regionally, and it's available in much greater detail. And the power, right, of our computing, the power of shared data actually allows us to prioritize investment areas. So I think we can actually be a lot smarter about where we're directing the investment so that we're protecting vulnerable populations. Our colleagues in small island states, right, really do have an existential threat, and we need to really look at where we have to do managed retreat and where we have to do different kinds of building. That's a big issue for our small island states, and even for some of our archipelago states. So I think we need to use good data and share definitions of how we prioritize investment. I think the other thing is we have to have a much more mature conversation about the finance, right? The insurance sector is a very natural partner, right, for this kind of work, because number one, they have a lot of risk models. Number two, they have an interest in avoided losses. And I think that when we think about structuring the returns, and obviously development banks are very forgiving, very low interest rates, very long term. These are good partnerships. I think the role of blended finance has a lot to do in this space, is actually providing those longer terms for investment and also reducing the cost of capital on the best types of investment.
Thank you. And thanks. Welcome to here, Professor Stiglitz. Joe, thanks for making it. And we'll continue the conversation. I will turn to Joe in a minute. Finance is one very important part, but also we heard from last panel that technology provides a lot of solution, and most of the technology are ready. Why can that be transferred to ASEAN countries?
Well, I think when we talk about climate readiness, we talk about resilience, all resilience is local, right? Your risk, right, and your capacity, right, is going to tell you whether or not you're going to be able to absorb a shock, right, or a stress. So there are a lot of technologies that are available, but there has to be kind of that last mile implementation support for a lot of these things. I am extremely hopeful, and we're going to talk about the metaverse, right? I am extremely hopeful about the possibilities for us to use technology to actually extend the way we transfer technology. I do think that there's an incredible opportunity where we used to have to organize, study tours and think about logistics and health and safety, for us to do a lot more of that through virtual knowledge sharing and through expertise. I think that there's also a need to think about scale, hub and spoke models in emerging markets, using state and provinces that are in particular vulnerable, that we do know have the capacity to take a solution and then share it with the neighboring cities around them. And one example that we've been working on for quite some time is in the state of Gujarat in India. I know that's not in ASEAN, but not so far out of the neighborhood. And in Surat, they have a very common problem to many cities who are climate challenged in the region, which is that they have a massive river that runs through the city. It's a highly polluted river because Surat produces, for those who are familiar or not familiar with Surat, a lot of the garments for India and for the world. They also cut a lot of the diamonds, but that's a different conversation. And so what Surat has done is they have looked at a complete adaptation plan around Tapi River and also a comprehensive change for the industry that reduces emissions. And they've now shared that experience through the state level to 8 other cities in Gujarat state. So I think in terms of appropriate technology and getting the message out, we can work very closely with different governments and the private sector together to then localize and scale.
Maybe a couple of comments. I actually was fascinated you brought up Gujarat because one thing that I've tried to foster at AIB is to build a geospatial data platform, because I think a lot of the issues that you spoke about is going to be dealt with through geospatial analysis. And so we did AIB did its first completed projects was a small roads project or rural road project in Gujarat. And I don't know, those who follow the discussions about the investments in roads, and there's a very well established paper looking at the sort of high level roads in India, and they show that very little impact on development from these investments. And people sort of wonder, whether this could be really true. So we looked at these rural roads, and there have been a major program in Gujarat, and what we could show that actually why they were so significant were that they brought exactly that last mile connectivity and realized the potential of these higher level roads. So, by doing this, building these small roads, people could, start benefiting from, more job opportunities, better health, better access to education, and so on. So just a kind of side remark to it, since you brought up Gujarat, but I think that the really exciting possibility there is now to layer on top of that climate-related data, climate and climate vulnerability, also data on top of that. But I actually want to go back to something we spoke about before, because when we talk about access to technology for countries, it's a lot about standards. And what I see really changing in Asia now, and I can speak from it, from my sitting in Beijing, the thinking has completely changed. It used to be that you work with local standards and you do infrastructure projects according to local standards. We shouldn't impose any standards on countries. I think that it was probably well intended, but what was clear, it didn't work, because you're putting in place, inferior technologies, that will be with you for 20, 30, 40 years. And it's not in the interest of those countries. It's not interested of the global system. We need to ensure and of course provide the financing and the support, but we need to get the state of the art. Of course, it has sometimes you don't always need the most sophisticated technology, but you need sufficiently good technology that can work in these environments and really focus on the impact you're having on what you're trying to address. If it's about reducing the carbon footprint, that should be the focus of when we think about technology. So that makes me very hopeful about the possibilities in Asia, that this is actually changing dramatically. And also, if you look just on we don't have any involvement in the Belt and Road Initiative, but I'm watching it from the side, and you can see how that is also changing, that the quality of investment becoming much more important, private sector involvement is becoming much more important, and really looking at how we can raise standards. The neighbor in the office is actually something called the Multilateral Center for Development Finance, which is an initiative of 6 countries at the moment, and it's all about raising standards. It's everything, and they started, with actually debt transparency and trying to get greater transparency around debt. Of course, this is a big issue, but it also looking at climate transparency, looking at measurement of carbon footprint and so on, climate smart connectivity. So I think that's a lot of new thinking, luckily in Asia, that we can make use of.
I'm going to pick up on that with a fear and then maybe a hope. As I say to my daughters when they call me from Singapore to tell me what's happening there, always bad news first, then tell mommy the good news. So one thing that concerns me is that we have phenomenal global standards and conversations, right? And World Business Council for Sustainable Development and this forum and many others, COP26. But when we talk about who's winning most of the projects on the ground in developing Asia, these are local actors, local construction companies, SMEs, who don't have the capacity nor the incentive to do things differently. And these are mostly in secondary cities, right, that are emerging quickly, or even smaller cities than that. And they're going to build this infrastructure once, and then it's going to last for 20 or 30 or 50 or even 80 years. So that's a concern. I think a hope on the flip side of that is that we quickly figure out how to share the incentives to do things better. And we were debating a little bit about this at lunch in terms of what we think about when we think about what emissions belong to a national grid or a country, and what emissions belong to companies, and how they can trade those. Because even for, and I had the privilege of sitting in on the real estate governors meeting at the WEF, was yesterday, even for the biggest players, they will say openly, there are lots of sticks and not a lot of carrots. So if they are feeling that way about real estate development, and we know that over 90% of investment in cities is happening from local actors, then what are the smaller guys saying, and gals, right? They're saying the same thing, or even worse. They're going to just try to get the deal, right? Which is normal. That's business as usual. So we have to figure out, and I hope we will quickly figure out, how to localize and share benefits with actors, because I don't know a leader of any company or a mayor in any of the cities that I've ever talked to that says, I don't want to meet net zero. I don't want to keep my citizens safe and increase equity. Of course they do, but they need help to figure out how, and they need resources.
Thanks. And I saw Ling Hai was wanting to contribute from Light, and then Rui Hua, and then we'll invite Professor Stiglitz to give us a special remark.
Thank you so much. My question is, I just want to pick on the equity point. My question is really about the cost of clean energy. I mean, I think poor people or low-income people, they don't burn coal and burn wood because they like to smell the smoke or the bad air. It's because that's what's affordable, right? So how do we not let this also get into this, become another nail in the coffin, or exacerbation of the massive divide? That is, it becomes a luxury. Green energy is a luxury for the rich because they can afford it. So how do we know we're able to bring down the cost to a level where this can be afforded by all before we dismantle the traditional carbon infrastructure and everything else? And that I heard this in Singapore, which I think is a very valid point, because you're reducing the investment in the traditional energy production, but the scale and the efficiency really have not come to fruition for non-carbon based green energy. So I feel like there's a disconnect here, and I would love to hear your views on this and what it takes to really get there. fundamentally, I'm a businessman. I believe nothing is sustainable if it doesn't have a good revenue or profit model, right? You just can't expect goodwill to be the driving force behind all of that.
So maybe this is a place where I should intervene. So, oh, okay. So, you know, what's happened to energy markets in the last 10, 15 years is very dramatic. The price of renewable energy has really come down to be more, it's really competitive with old fossil fuel technologies. And one of the things, you know, even though the sun is not totally reliable, as we see here in Davos, it's more reliable than Putin. And one of the things that we know, you know, economists have studied, Erik, is, you know, things called the natural resource curse. A very large fraction of the fossil fuels are controlled by authoritarian figures. And so if you are dependent on fossil fuels, you'll get the oil crisis of 1970s and the Russian crisis of today. So when I walked in, you were talking about resilience, and part of resilience, I think, is moving to renewables. So it's both cheaper and more resilient. One remark I wanted to make that was a little bit related to what Erik was saying. There's been a lot of debate about whether developing countries, emerging markets, should be given more leeway in meeting climate change targets. You know, I've been a little bit critical of China saying we're going to be carbon neutral by 2060. I said, why not 2050? My view is that it's a disadvantage for developing countries and emerging countries to move slowly, because you know, all the technologies you're talking about and investments are 20, 30, 40-year investments. Why would you want to saddle yourself to investments in technologies that are so 19th century rather than 21st century? You know, in other words, there's a big advantage of being part, you know, say China is growing so fast, you have the opportunity to put in the most advanced technologies and really to be at the forefront of where all the technologies are. So, and one of the things that we've learned is you learn about technology by investing in technology. And, you know, if you don't invest it, you don't learn. One of the reasons why the United States was shown to be so lack of resilient in COVID-19, why we weren't able to produce even simple product like masks, is because we stopped producing it. Once we stopped producing it, we lost that knowledge. And so if you start using, and I call it learning by doing, we call it learning by using, learning by investing, you get a competitive advantage. Korea became the most efficient steel producer in the world. And it didn't do it by studying the textbooks on steel producing. I don't know if there are any textbooks on steel producing. What they did is they said, we want to be an industrial country. And the only way to become an industrial country is to become an industrial country. And so they asked Japan to build, help them build a steel factory. And then they took that and got better and better and better and better at it until the point where they were better than any other country at that moment in steel production. So my feeling is that there are big advantages to being ahead of the game. Now, there is always the question, as I was walking here, we were going to talk about finance and how do you finances. That's another issue, and this issue of blended finance using some lower cost finance and blending that with private sector finance, and there are a whole set of financial issues of how you can organize the paying for it that are not trivial. But in terms of strategy, business strategy, it seems to make the most sense to try to be as much ahead of the game as one can, and always remembering these are long-term investments, and that the knowledge you get by the investment is going to be part of the knowledge base that is permanently with you. And I guess the only other final remark I'll make is a lot of the when we put the green transition, we talk about energy quite naturally, but it's every part of the economic system. And so you have to think about systems change very broadly: transportation, energy. Oh, thank you. Well, I can't move. Okay. Systems, energy, everything. And the example that the two of you gave about roads is a very general example. Looking at rural roads, trunk roads without thinking about rural roads is obviously a mistake. And the interesting thing is we should have known about that. In the United States, in the Great Depression, we made very large investments in rural roads, including the roads that linked places to the railroads. And there is at least one study that has argued that that was an enormously productive investment. The reason the US grew is that we used the time of the Great Depression to make these investments, the value of which then showed up in World War II and the years afterwards. And those investments were actually critical to the success of the United States in the war and then after the war.
Yes, I want to pick up one thing that Joe was saying, which I think is so important. So there's been massive improvements when it comes to renewables in terms of the functionality and the cost. But it's also when the big issue is, of course, what you call the intermittency, that is not as still as reliable. But even there, through battery and storage possibility, we are making progress. But I think the really big reason for doing what Joe was saying is, this is a much more flexible technology. And I think what is a bit the problem of many of these technologies, were not developed primarily to serve emerging and developing countries. So that kind of learning and working with these advanced technologies, adjusting them to local conditions, that's a very important part. And if you are still continuing to use old style technology, you won't have that learning component. It's bad for you, but it's also bad for the world as a whole. And so I think that's what, when we talk about investing and using international standards, it's very much about, we want to be part of bringing this technology into countries, and this systemic thinking that Joe was talking about also. I think it's in this space so important. And take just the electric vehicles, you need to think of the whole system of batteries of cars, if you charging stations and so on, and all that needs to be coordinated. It's a huge challenge for state capacity in emerging developing countries, and you won't be able to do it without participation from the private sector. So this to me is the real challenge. How can we harness and also build state capacity? I think there's a huge role for private sector to help the state become more effective in how it delivers on these technologies.
I just want to make two quick comments, and I think this is risky because I'm sitting with two much more qualified economists than myself. I left the LSE and then I actually never worked as an economist, unlike these gentlemen. So, I mean, I think the question you ask also has a lot to do with the difference between the finance of the projects and the economics of the projects. And I think the reality, and I'm going to try to refrain from having my Jennifer Garner don't look up moment where I just turn red and say, oh my gosh, this is real. But the fact that we have been subsidizing, right, the fossil fuel industry for so long, right, is a huge factor in keeping that cost low. And the fact that there isn't yet a tax on the bad in the form of a carbon tax that's universal is also a huge market failure, as it were, if you believe in the economics of climate change, which I will say I do. There's a lot of work that's done on that, and that the value of that varies from the $5 that we have right now in Singapore to what the social cost of carbon is, which the Obama administration, I think maybe someone will correct me, was like over $150 a ton.
Well,
there were different
the
ones.
Biden administration has not yet come up with the right answer. I've been trying to tell it what the right answer is.
Okay.
And it is around $125, $150.
Okay.
So you're right, but they haven't quite yet gotten the message.
Yeah, so if you can just imagine, I think adding that cost into how we think about project finance is going to be really critical, and it's coming fast. So I would say that was the one thing that I wanted to share about that. And then I think the other thing was going back to resilience. So if you look at the possibilities for distributed renewables, they are massive. And the very quick case study that I would give is Houston. So the mayor of Houston, Sylvester Turner, is the chairman of our board, and they went through a shock that the whole world watched when they had a blizzard and the energy grid couldn't take it. People were burning their fences in Houston, Texas to keep warm, and people died. I mean, because they couldn't get access to water, they couldn't get access to energy in hospital and at home. So I mean, this isn't just a failure that we might have in emerging markets, right? It's a failure that we've actually entrenched so deeply in some energy systems that the energy capital of the United States can't make it through a winter storm. So we have to change this. we have to build in that equity and that resilience into our energy system. And the way that we need to do that is through changing the economics and the finance of the projects.
I can't help but add a certain irony in that experience in Texas, because Texas is one of the states where the governor is a climate denier. So they were punished maybe by God for their climate denial.
And Ling Hai, as a Texas resident, can testify to that.
I was in Austin, Texas at the time.
Anyway, yeah, exactly.
And then energy prices for the consumers, right? They pass it up, they try to pass it up to consumers.
Exactly. Yeah.
It would have been even worse had they not had the wind and
Yeah.
So we're slowly running short of time. I know a lot of people have questions. How about we collect questions and then we invite our next keynote speaker, and then we answer all that after the next keynote. So whoever has questions can raise their hand. Have a quick question, comment. Rihua, you remember you had one?
So thanks all for the great, exciting conversation, very personal conversation, and now also including Professor Stiglitz. My question is back to what Professor Berglof said earlier, that the Middle East has not been able to participate in global value chains as extensively. And you were saying that climate is actually a value proposition that they could use. And my question is actually, do you have real examples where you can, as a country, try to bring yourself into regional or global value chains with this proposition? Thanks.
Just my question will be maybe from the practitioners' angles into bringing solutions to the emerging world. So very quickly, I'm a believer in technology, and I have brought technologies and renewables to Asia. Unfortunately, where I usually end up failing is in two areas. One is around the fact that the best technologies don't necessarily make it and win. To your point, sub technologies are sometimes winning the bids, public bids. And the other is around just the general awareness of the desirability solutions. So my question really is, I understand how we improve unit economics of technologies, and we do it. how can we improve, if you will, unit economics of education in these fields? That's a big problem we face in Asia. It's just, if you're not going to throw your plastic through the bus, it's not because someone's telling you not to do it, it's because you yourself are aware of not doing it. So that's one, that's a big issue we face. And the second has to do with how can we make regulation more efficient? And to my point, in China, we have done very well on electric because at one point the government said we're phasing out this whole generation. In Southeast Asia, there haven't been bold steps there. So how can we make both education better and regulation better? How can we make the unit economics of both? That's something that from my technologist perspective, I've never really been able to harness perfectly. So we can keep it for later.
It's right next to Julian. So just very simple, short question. So what about catch-up growth? Does each country and each region really need to reinvent the wheel or work on the same solutions? Can a lot of countries not just wait, let's say, until 2040 and then just take the technologies that other countries already produced and then, and maybe it's a very simple and naive question, but just what about just catch-up growth?
It's like do we have like burning answers? If we do, we'll go very quickly a round of burning answers and then turn to Bo for the keynote presentation.
Let me begin with just part of the answer to your question. One, a number of countries are beginning to, include United States and Europe, are beginning to consider cross-border taxes. It's very likely that U.S. will pass a cross-border tax this year. I've heard a couple of the senators walking around. So whether that, what that means is any country that doesn't have strong green policies is going to be punished. So you can say that's an incentive, both for the country and for the company. And it's an incentive for the country to design quickly a regulatory structure and to figure it out, an efficient one, which will entail both regulation and I think a carbon price. It'll be a mixture and public investment. So I think that is part of the answer. The other part of the answer to your question, I think, how do you internalize in individuals an awareness of the environment, and you might kind of say the externalities. We're here in Switzerland, and they've done a very good job of internalizing externalities about littering. Nobody litters, or almost nobody litters. And it's not because they're fined, it's not a regulation. They may be fined, it probably is a regulation, I'm sure there is, but it's enforced by internalization of the regulation. And I think there has been among younger people that process. So people become more and more aware of the issue of, broadly saving the planet, that it has become internalized in the younger generation. And that's why they feel so strongly about these issues. So it's not perfect, and the two need to work together, because you can implement regulations much more easily when most people are complying. And it's much harder when there's resistance, as we've seen in the health regulations in the United States. The issue you asked about why not wait and catch up is really part of the what I was trying to address when I said you pay a penalty for waiting in two ways. You pay a penalty that you're paying a high cost because you're wedded to an outmoded technology, and you lose the learning benefits of getting hitched up earlier to the new technologies. It is, quite frankly, it is an issue on which there is some controversy in economics. It goes under the optimal transition, and some people say we should have a slow transition, including a slow transition in prices. And I've taken the opposite view, that really you ought to take a quick transition, and the developing countries should not wait. But I don't want to pretend that not everybody agrees with me on that issue. But I think the argument for not being behind in technology, especially in countries that are growing so fast, where they have the opportunity to learn as they're doing and implement them, is fairly compelling.
Erik?
No, so I think, catch-up growth. What is catch-up growth? It's imitation and adaptation. And it's exactly that adaptation that I think Joe is talking about, and what I spoke about earlier, how you can become better at, for example, doing renewables in individual countries. So I think there is we need to move quickly, I think, and as those forms of legislation or new tariffs are going to be a reality. And my big concern is that we're going to have a lot of stranded assets in the emerging and developing world because of these new rules. Just on the quick question on the global value chain. So I think these pressures have not been so strong until very recently. So it's probably not so easy to find very good examples. The best example to my mind is what's happening to my own country, actually. So the north of Sweden used to be viewed as completely hopeless. It's more like it's almost development assistance to have this kind of, develop that part of the country. What we're seeing now is hundreds of thousands of new jobs being created, and it's all about green power and green steel. So a week ago, the first net zero steel was produced in Sweden, and this is a lot of these new battery producers are locating in the north of Sweden because they have access to green power. You see it in China, in the Yunnan province, massive movement of, not only driven by carbon considerations, maybe sometimes by cost considerations, but massive movement of aluminum melters, for example, to Yunnan. And I can bet you that Egypt, for example, which made massive investments in renewables, will benefit and will have much more opportunities to attract this kind of global value chain investment.
I have three very fast things, and I'm from New Jersey, so I talk very, very quickly. So the first one is network around solutions, right? So aggregate solutions for appropriate problems, right? And multiple challenges at once, and then deploy them. Use technology to define where to prioritize. And I mentioned that at the beginning of my remarks, and I think we're better positioned to look at different kinds of vulnerabilities and different kinds of opportunities to solve challenges in a way that is actually more transparent than we have ever been. And then the third thing is actually the scope of a totally different panel, which we're not having, but I do want to leave it there because I think that this group has a lot of connectivity. And I think that we have to simplify the access to catalytic capital. I think that what's really interesting, but also potentially dangerous about the proliferation of catalytic philanthropy and impact funds is that it sometimes makes it impossible for those who need innovation most to access that capital. And it turns secondary city or startup entrepreneurs into acrobats and trying to meet everyone's theory of change. So I think that the more that we can aggregate around shared outcomes with finance, with data, and then with proven solutions, I think the faster we can go.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. And please join me in thanking all our panelists for this roundtable discussion. And let me invite Bai Bo, the founder and the CEO of Metaverse Green Exchange, to give us a keynote presentation, and then we'll have the network and afternoon tea. But thank you very much.
That was a fascinating panel discussion. And thank you, Erik. Thank you, Lauren. And thank you, Professor, for coming to share with us. And then it's just simply a phenomenon to hear what all you shared with us today. I actually want to start with the problem that we're trying to address, which to some of you in the audience is preaching to the choir. That is the nationality issue of a carbon credit. And then that is a huge problem for emerging economy. But Professor Stiglitz' very encouraging viewpoint really gives me a lot of encouragement, is similar to how many of the emerging economy leapfrogged in the whole telecom. Without the phone, they directly went to the mobile, and then how that changed many of their economy. And I think we also have an opportunity to solve this problem with a system that can leapfrog the challenges. We're really just trying to tap into two major macro trends that is happening and then will continue for another 5 to 10 years. One is the whole need to solve the climate issue for sustainability. Two is how can we utilize all the tools, technology, people are using it for fun, for games, for whatever other things to solve the climate problem. And Erik pointed out correctly that to do this properly, you need to get a certain certification, guidance, and registration, and so forth. We are actually licensed in Singapore, and really thanks to a Monetary Authority of Singapore's progressive and rigorous system to allow us to be able to do this. And from the very beginning, 3 years ago, we partnered with the NASDAQ. What we're really trying to build with the NASDAQ is we're building a connection infrastructure for digital carbon to be traded freely, cross-border, particularly flowing from an emerging country to developed world. Everything is on the cloud, on public blockchain. Because of the efficiency of energy and the environment is not great on the blockchain, so we also utilize the NASDAQ matching engine in the middle. But on top of that, our system allows everything in the future, in our view, should not only have a financial number. Every asset in the world put in the right system should have a carbon footprint number on it. Is it a carbon asset or is it a carbon liability? We build our ledger with that capability. And it really is trying to make these connected carbon trading networks for emerging economies. Now, let me hit on what is the problem. When we move from Kyoto to Paris to COP26, one very exciting thing happened is that more than 190 countries signed up to it. That's fascinating. COP26, and then we achieved the final piece, Article 6, from Paris Agreement agreed upon. But this was the reaction from some emerging countries. Indonesia minister come to say, no, we don't want to allow carbon trade globally. Why? And then when I travel to Europe, and then seems like most people in European Unions are not listening to us. They don't even know that when we come from emerging countries, people are concerned and worried about it. What are people worried about? And then another big thing happening around the corner is the CBAM, the carbon border tax, which makes tons of sense from European perspective. And then you want to achieve to make sure that there is no carbon leakages. And then hence every product hit the border of Europe needs to have a carbon border tax. Now, what happens to China? What happens to Southeast Asia? What happens to these manufacturers when they have their product to come here? This is exactly what is needed as Erik said, the regulation is put in place to give them a push. But yes, there are a lot of sticks all over the places. Where are the carrots? The carrots were supposed to come as Paris Agreement, Article 6. 2015, everyone on this picture signed to that document. They committed their country to a goal of emission reduction that is called Nationally Determined Contribution, shortened as NDC. It is very much needed because we need all countries to work together to make this work. But carbon and climate crisis is a global problem. Suddenly, carbon has a nationality problem. And then all what we're observing, push through to the root cause is actually starting from Paris Agreement. Because when we did the Kyoto Protocol, emerging countries did not sign up to it. All they were doing is through clean development mechanism, selling carbon credit to European unions. And then they were just selling, getting capital, developing infrastructure projects to drive sustainability. Now, developing countries cannot do that anymore. From CDM to SDM under Paris Agreement. Now we have a developing country that has a renewable energy projects generated the carbon credits. And I'll talk about the standards in a second. The first question is, should we sell the credit or not? If I don't sell the credit, how do I get additional carrots of money, international capital, to further build out those green projects? But if I sell the credit, how am I now going to satisfy my commitment to United Nations? Because I signed up to United Nations to also reduce my carbon emission as a country. So sell or not sell, out of all the good intention of all those 190 leaders becomes a problem. Second thing, there was I'm a physicist by training from MIT, and as a nerd, you know, one of my professor wrote away the nerdy way of doing business, and then I was joking with him, I don't know any other way, and I was a nerdy way is my only way. So the nerdy way has two portions. One is to find the root cause, and then two is to find the unconventional solution. If I actually a little bit deeper, so if Paris Agreement was actually the root cause of the dilemma developing countries are facing, and then another root cause of the problem is a company individual climate action equals to country climate action? These all come from the old days because it is always compliant, always regulatory, always these efforts are driving net zero. But nowadays, 10 years later, the world has changed. The world has got into such a way that many organizations, many people say, I want to be carbon neutral as an organization, as an individual. And then I'm a Swiss company. I want to do that, not because I want to help Swiss country to meet the United Nations standard, because I as an organization want to do that. So company activity is not necessarily the same as country activity anymore, but the Paris Agreement was developed with that assumption before. So the challenge for people right now to buy carbon credits internationally is, in order to become carbon neutral, we need to first mitigate, reduce carbon, improve energy efficiency, reduce carbon credit. But there's the residual amount that we need to do. If you buy from Malaysia before COP26, there's no system to make sure it's really transferred to you. After COP26 and hopefully COP27, we'll do more details. But even then, so if you are a say Swiss company, you just want to become carbon neutral, why do you have to take that carbon credit out of Malaysia? And so that Malaysia cannot report to the United Nations anymore, and then you're helping your country to report to the United Nations while your country actually doesn't need you to do so. That is the current system. And that is the pain for emerging country that we think there should be a solution. Another problem actually Erik was also talking about is there are a lot of the registries, and then there is a huge disparity between people's point of view is meta registry versus local registry, meaning who controls the resource. And if you talk to people in DC or US, most people think, yeah, we're going to manage it for the developing country. And I visited 4 countries right after COVID freeze up. Every one of them said no, they want to manage themselves, because that is essentially the natural resource. So how do you solve all this problem? This is where we actually developed the system to separate the nationality of carbon credit from this commercial and environmental attributes of this carbon credit. Separate them, because the assumption has changed. Separate them. Carbon neutrality token is a digital carbon credit and a financial security, represent a digital deposit receipt of 1 ton of a certified registered carbon voluntary emission reduction. It's a very mouthful, I know. And I've been studying carbon market for 15 years, and then working on this concept for 3 years with the patents writing, system building, spend all the money and efforts. What we're doing is make this separate. And in order to separate, we actually had to develop some blockchain technology under Metaverse to represent assets with the real world assets. I'm not going to get into that. But what really is testing out is we're doing China as a proof of concept. And China has developed a lot of national registry. The whole carbon infrastructure system has been developed in China, particularly the national registry. So we take the highest quality carbon credit, China certified emission reduction, compliant ready. And then it is from a window project, all sorts of project, nature-based solution, certified under the same UN CDM standards. And then that can be certified by the accredited firm, and also recorded on the China's national registry. So, and then what we worked with the China system is we put on that registry that it's a freezing so that nobody in China can trade or sell or use it for commercial purpose anymore. So reporting wise to United Nations, this is China's carbon credit, belongs to the country from a national reporting perspective. But in terms of use it for voluntary carbon neutrality purpose, nobody in China can do that anymore. It's gone. It's not in China anymore. We take that out as a digital security, as a digital token. And then we make this a free-flowing product for people to utilize it for all sorts of purpose. Now, you may say that may be just totally a pipe dreaming. And then how would the world even accept such a thing? How can you use it for carbon neutrality? And then what is carbon neutrality? Carbon neutrality is to neutralize your carbon footprint. And then hence, somebody needs to certify you're carbon neutral. And there is indeed an international standard past 2060, which will become ISO standard for carbon neutrality. And then we decided to give ourselves the best try. We say, if we can give ourselves ISO carbon neutrality certificate, our carbon credit should be to go. Took us 6 months to work with the BSI, British Standards Institution, but we thank them for their progressiveness, for even to give us a try, to study the whole process, the whole system, to understand actually this meets their ISO carbon neutrality standard. This was only done until March this year, 2 months ago. So when all this is done, naturally, we want to do this with many developing countries. So we have the carbon credits come from China that comes with a similar type of UN CDM standards, but again, with the national registry. To Erik's point, standards is extremely important. Taxonomy is extremely important. So as much as possible, hopefully people or more countries will adopt this ICVCM, Integrated Council on Voluntary Carbon Market, this type of standards. But right now there are Vera, there are gold standard. Those are different type of standards. They all arising from a CDM old days. Whether it's Vera, this gold standard, is also extremely important whether this country adopts it or not. So from standards to a certification firm, international ones, most importantly with the registry. And I think the meta registry and the national registry will coexist. And many sizable countries may prefer their own national registry because that's how they're going to manage this transfer for essentially changing the passport of carbon credits. But with our system, we don't change the passport. We just freeze in that country. And then you become a free-flowing carbon for many purposes. We're building the whole system for different purposes. It turns out that most countries in the world doesn't have a registry. And then many of them over the past 3 months or 4 months say, we want to have our own registry. And to Professor Stiglitz's point, that we are actually building all our registry powered by cloud and blockchain. We're essentially leapfrogged the old system that we're providing to whichever country wants to use it for free. And then so that from this registry, they can actually directly create these free-flowing carbon credits in a digital format. So we provided that as a service and a product to government for free. We serve business as a carbon management system to work with the business to achieve carbon neutrality for their operation as well as products. We're talking, for example, with 5-star hotels who have an operation can freely use these carbon credits for carbon neutrality purpose so that their customers are carbon neutral stay. In addition, once the highest quality of carbon, highest certification and a national registry with this type of system is established, the carbon can be utilized by many consumer applications now. And it can be part of a gift card and your country souvenir and even carbon credit cards for people to use back and forth. And then they can use it for many areas and a gift. At the front door when you come in, and then we bring a small box of gift for you. And then every one card is a digital carbon credit. It's a token. Green was never sexy, and then we're trying to do a piece of our work to make a green or carbon a little bit sexier, a little bit easier for people to understand what it is. What it does is it's a gift card. It is a gift card to neutralize your travel from where you are to Davos. Put your cell phone right next to it. A website shows up, and there is an NFC sensor in it. That's a near field communication. And then that allows you to put your information of your trip. And then when you click that button, say, hey, my trip, like when I flight from Singapore to here, my trip was about 3 tons of carbon emissions. That's horrible. Professor Stiglitz, it's horrible. Even just myself, I was 3 tons. I don't weigh that much. But think about how much carbon standing on to carry myself here. Think about the private jetters, that's even unimaginable. But when you click that button to neutralize your trip to here, what happened behind the scene? We purchased the carbon credits from China, put on the China's national registry, freeze it, and then make it, nobody can use it in China. And then it becomes such a free commodity. And when you click that, it's ultimately put that 3 tons of carbon credits from China's winter project to your travel, to my travel from Singapore to here. And everything can be traced back. And then the beauty of this, nobody can change it once this is utilized. It's on distributed ledger, maintained globally. Nobody can change it. And then that's the beauty of the system that we're trying to build. Sometimes we give to the government is once this system is utilized, even future government cannot change it anymore because all this information and it's in terms of its certification is also on the blockchain. And for some of the younger generation who is just buying NFT of all sorts of games and futures, we also mint NFT. This is a carbon neutrality NFT. And this is actually published on our gallery. And then who knows, maybe one day and Lauren goes back and say, hey, you know what, give to your daughter and here's my NFT, neutralize your travel to here. And then that is, we don't do any other NFT. We have all the infrastructure, but we only do one NFT, carbon neutrality NFT. And we hope to see more and more of this type of different activities come here. We're talking to a toy manufacturer and we're saying, hey, put that NFC small sensor in the nose of that teddy bear and then buy that product at home. And then if we work with a certification firm, your teddy bear should carry not only every other information, the price should also have a carbon tag. This teddy bear, maybe not a 3 ton, maybe should be less, maybe 0.5 ton of carbon, maybe 0.2. And then you tell your daughter, do you want to make that teddy bear carbon neutral? Put your phone on that teddy bear's nose. A website shows up, click the button. An NFT shows up on the blockchain. It's carbon neutral teddy bear for you. So we don't do that. We provide all the infrastructure, but we want to use the people's power to drive it. We provide all the infrastructure work. And then we are trying to find some other partners who co-brand it. But the whole point is emerging country needs a solution, but the solution needs to have integrity. And then we're safeguarding the integrity of carbon credits by 2 pillars. One is the real world national process. It's needed. This is not some technical weirdo can solve. And I came from MIT, there are enough nerds, they cannot solve that problem because nobody on blockchain can guarantee that that carbon credit is not double, triple, quadruple used in the real world. That a national registry can guarantee that. And once we put that national registry on the blockchain, the national government cannot change that either. So that is the integrity on the national part, and also the integrity on all the blockchain to protect its traceability and immutability. So that's what we do, and we are, very grateful that you all spend the afternoon with us and enjoy the tea, and take the gift and then make it a carbon neutral for a trip. Thank you.
Thanks, Bo. Thanks all. That will wrap up our discussion this afternoon. So do take your time enjoying the food and the tea and chat more with our wonderful guests today. So thank you all for participating.